We just sold this house. You are moving to a house for the elderly." I said, "Great, let's go to the police station first. They are very interested in what I sent them about you. My name is Nathan Parker. I'm 63 years old. I live in Miami, Florida, and I've spent the last 4 decades doing everything right, working double shifts at the port, paying my taxes, raising a daughter who I thought hung the moon. I've never asked anyone for anything. I've never cheated anyone out of so much as a parking space. So, when a 29-year-old with a fake tan, a leased BMW, and the moral compass of a sea cucumber decided that my house was his for the taking, he had no idea who he was dealing with. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out. Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, every villain in these stories thought they were the smartest person in the room. They were not. Subscribe so you never miss a story. I need to back up because what happened on that Saturday morning in September didn't start in September. It started 18 months earlier, on the day my daughter Caitlin brought Cody Jenkins home for the first time. My late wife, Brittany, always said I had good instincts about people. She passed 7 years ago, breast cancer, sudden, cruel, the way those things always are. Before she left us, she grabbed my hand and said, "Nathan, keep an eye on our girl. She trusts too easy, just like I did when I met you, except you were actually worth it." I laughed. I cried. I kept the promise. So, when Caitlin walked through my front door in April of the year before last and said, "Dad, I want you to meet someone," I was already paying attention. Cody Jenkins walked in behind her like he owned the place. That was the first thing I noticed. Not humble, not nervous the way a good man is when he meets his girlfriend's father for the first time. He walked in slow, hands in his pockets, eyes moving around the living room like he was appraising it, like he was calculating square footage. He shook my hand and said, "Mr. Parker, beautiful home. How long have you had this place?" Not, "Nice to meet you." Not, "Caitlin talks about you all the time." The first thing out of his mouth was a question about my property. I said, 31 years. He smiled. "Must be worth a lot now." "Miami real estate has gone crazy," I said. "I suppose it has." I didn't like him. I didn't say that to Caitlin because I'd learned the hard way that telling a 26-year-old woman you don't like her boyfriend is the fastest way to make sure she marries him. Instead, I smiled. I made dinner. I watched. And what I watched over the next several months made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in a way it hadn't, since I worked night shifts at the port and learned to identify trouble before it got close enough to introduce itself. Cody Jenkins, as far as I could tell, did not have a real job. He called himself a real estate investor. He had a website, professionally made, I'll give him that, and a LinkedIn profile that listed 4 different LLCs, none of which I could find any actual business records for. He drove the BMW, he wore the watch. He always picked up the check at dinner, which impressed Caitlin enormously, and impressed me not at all because I had grown up around enough hustlers to know that a man who's always paying for dinner is either genuinely generous, or he's buying goodwill he'll cash in later. Cody Jenkins was not generous. I started digging quietly. Nothing aggressive. I'm not law enforcement, just a father paying attention. I talked to my neighbor Alicia, who worked in county records, and asked her to keep her eyes open for anything with Cody's name on it. I talked to my buddy Morgan, who'd worked in title insurance for 20 years and had seen every variety of property fraud imaginable. I asked him to explain to me, hypothetically, how a person might try to steal a house from an elderly parent of a spouse. Morgan didn't even blink. He said, "You want the long list or the short list?" I said, "Morgan, I want every single method in order of how common they are." He gave me 2 hours of his time and a yellow legal pad full of notes. I took that legal pad home and I read it 3 times. I didn't know it yet, but that yellow legal pad was going to save everything. Caitlin and Cody got engaged in November. I hugged my daughter, told her I loved her, and spent the next hour in my garage pretending to organize tools while I processed what was happening. She was happy. I had to remember that. She was genuinely happy the way Brittany used to be happy. That full-body kind of joy that makes a person look like they're lit from the inside. I wasn't going to take that from her. Not yet, not without proof. But I was going to be ready. I called Morgan the next morning. I said, I need you to walk me through the irrevocable trust thing again. He said, Nathan, you sure? Once you put the house in an irrevocable trust, you can't easily pull it back out. I said, I know. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, how bad is it? I said, I don't know yet, but I'd rather have the umbrella and not need it than need it and not have it. He said, I'll call my attorney. Her name is Sierra. She's good. She'll set it up clean. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Sierra in her office on Brickell Avenue. She was sharp, mid-40s, organized, no nonsense. She explained everything. The house would go into an irrevocable trust. I would remain the sole beneficiary and trustee during my lifetime. The property could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without my explicit written consent as trustee, witnessed and notarized, with a mandatory 72-hour review period built in. Any attempt to sell or transfer the property without following that exact procedure would be legally void. Not just contested, void, as in it never happened. She slid the documents across the desk and said, This is about as bulletproof as I can make it. Nobody's taking this house from you without going through a process that would take months and require your cooperation at every step. I signed. I didn't tell Caitlin. I didn't tell anyone except Morgan and Sierra. I went home, put the trust documents in a fireproof safe in my bedroom closet, and went back to watching. The wedding was in June. Outdoor ceremony at a venue in Coral Gables, one of those places with Spanish tile and bougainvillea everywhere. On 20 guests. Caitlin wore Brittany's veil. That part got me. I won't pretend it didn't. I walked her down the aisle and thought about Brittany the entire time. Thought about how she'd have cried happy tears and embarrassed herself in front of everyone and not cared one bit. Cody stood at the altar in his white tux and his practiced smile, and I watched his eyes the whole time. You know what I noticed? He barely looked at Caitlin during the vows. His eyes kept moving to the guests, to the venue, to his phone when he thought no one was watching. I was watching. I gave the toast. I said all the right things. I danced with my daughter. I shook Cody's hand and called him son, which cost me something. I'll tell you that for free. Then I went home and called Alicia. Alicia, I need to know if anything's been filed in the last 6 months with Cody Jenkins' name on it. Anything at all, she said. Nathan, it's 11 at night. I said, I know. I'm sorry. First thing tomorrow? She sighed the way only a woman who's known you for 15 years can sigh. First thing tomorrow, she said. I didn't know it then. But what Alicia found the next morning was going to be the last piece I needed. She called me at 8:47 a.m. Nathan. Her voice was flat in a way that made my stomach drop. There's a quitclaim deed that was filed 3 weeks ago, predated to February. I sat down slowly. Whose name is on it? Yours as grantor. Cody Jenkins and Caitlin Jenkins as grantees. I was very still for a long moment. Alicia, I did not sign that deed, she said quietly. I know. Nathan, the notary stamp on it is from a guy who had his license suspended in January. He's been doing dirty paperwork for cash. I've seen his name come up twice in fraud investigations this year. My daughter had been married for less than 24 hours. I said, Alicia, I need a certified copy of that document. Already printing it. I said, Don't tell anyone. Nathan, I've worked in this office for 17 years. You think this is my first rodeo? I drove to her office, picked up the copy, went straight to Sierra's. She looked at it for about 45 seconds and said, This is forgery. The trust structure alone makes it void, but the forged signature and the suspended notary make it a criminal matter. You need to go to the police. I said, Not yet. She looked up. Nathan, not yet, I said again. I want him to play his hand completely out. I want him to show up at my door thinking he's already won. Because when I go to the police, I want to walk in there with an open and shut case. Sierra studied me for a long moment. Then she said, You're going to let him think it worked. I said, For a little while. She leaned back in her chair and almost smiled. Don't wait too long, I said. I won't. I went home. I made coffee. I started building the file. over the next 3 months, while Cody and Caitlin were in their rented condo in Betrayal, and I was supposedly the unsuspecting 63-year-old widower in his paid-off house, I was assembling the most complete document package of my life. Morgan helped me trace Cody's LLCs. 2 of them were shell companies, no assets, no actual business, registered at addresses that turned out to be Youps stores. One of them had been used as the alleged buyer in 2 previous property deals that had gone sideways, including one in Hialeah, where an elderly woman had nearly lost her home before her grandson hired a lawyer who caught the fraud in time. That woman's name was in court records, public records. Morgan found her. Her grandson found me. What matters is that he had documentation of the exact same scheme: forged quitclaim deed, suspended notary, same phony LLC structure, different house, same Cody Jenkins. I added it to the file. I also, quietly and without making a scene of it, had Sierra look into the man who'd stamped my forged deed. Her office dug deep. By the time we were done, we had a copy of a sworn statement from a completely separate case where someone admitted to personally handing Cody cash in exchange for that fraudulent notary service. The file was getting thick. Then, in late September, Cody made his fatal mistake. He filed the fraudulent deed with the county recorder's office, the same one where Alicia worked. Now there was an official public record of his forgery, time-stamped and documented. He'd needed to file it to show a clear chain of title to any potential buyer because, as I would learn, he had already found one. The listing had gone up quietly. No MLS, no public posting, private sale, off-market, my house for $900,000. The deal was set to close in 45 days. Alicia called me the second she saw it. I said, "Alicia, is there a buyer under contract?" She said, "There's a purchase agreement on file." "Cash buyer, LLC." I said, 45 days. She said, "Nathan, you need to move." I said, "I'm moving." I called Sierra. I called Morgan. I called the Miami-Dade Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, where I had, over the previous 3 months, quietly developed a relationship with a detective who, well, let's just say she was exceptionally sharp. She was patient, and she absolutely loved receiving organized, well-documented evidence packages. I delivered mine in person, printed, tabbed, indexed, cover letter written by Sierra. 47 pages. The detective paged through it slowly, asking a question here and there. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Mr. Parker, this is one of the cleanest packages I've ever received. When do you think he'll make his move?" I said, "I'd give him about 2 weeks." She said, "We'll be ready." I said, "So will I." I didn't know exactly how right I was. It was 11 days. It was a Tuesday, overcast, the way Miami gets in October before a front comes through. I was drinking coffee on my back porch, looking at the yard Brittany and I had planted together, the bird of paradise, the sea grape, the old mango tree that gave us more fruit than we could ever eat. I was thinking about her, the way I often did on quiet mornings when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Then another car. I didn't move. I set my coffee down slowly. I already knew. The knock came hard. 3 sharp raps. I walked through my house, through the living room where I'd taught Caitlin to walk, past the kitchen where Brittany had made Sunday dinners for 30 years, to the front door. And I opened it. Cody Jenkins stood on my porch in a sport coat, freshly pressed, smelling like expensive cologne. Behind him was a woman in a blazer carrying a leather portfolio, the Notary. And beside her, looking like she hadn't slept in 2 days, was my daughter. Caitlin wouldn't meet my eyes. I knew then that she either knew and had gone along with it, or she knew and was horrified. I couldn't tell which. I told myself it was the second one. I kept telling myself that. Cody looked at me with the expression of a man who thinks he's holding all the cards, that particular brand of confidence, shiny, brittle, built on sand. He said, "Nathan, do you mind if we come in?" I said, "Sure, Cody, come on in." We stood in my living room. The Notary set her portfolio on my coffee table. Caitlin stood near the door with her arms crossed over her chest. Cody cleared his throat. He said, "So I want to be upfront with you about something. We've made some decisions about the property, and we wanted to come here personally to talk to you about the transition." Transition. That was the word he used. I said, "What kind of transition?" He said, "Well, we've actually sold this house. There's a purchase agreement in place. Close date is in about 5 weeks. The new owners are going to want possession. So we've been looking at some really lovely assisted living communities. One over in Pinecrest, one near Coconut Grove, and we've already started the admissions process at the one in Coconut Grove. It's a beautiful facility, Nathan. Pool, activities, 24-hour staff. You'll be comfortable." He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was a patient adult explaining a kind and reasonable arrangement to someone who might be confused. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at the notary, who was not looking at me. She was looking at her portfolio. Her jaw was tight. Then I looked at Caitlin, who was now looking at me, and her eyes were wet. And I could see that she had not known until recently, maybe not until this morning. Maybe he'd told her it was a good investment, that I'd agreed, that it was already handled. I'd never know exactly when the lie had started with her. But I knew she was scared, and I knew she loved me, and I knew this moment was going to define what happened to my family for the next 20 years. I said, "Cody." He said, "Yeah." I said, "That's interesting. That's really interesting, because I actually sent some documents to the police a few weeks ago. Financial Crimes Unit, officers who take their jobs seriously. They were very interested in what I had to say." Cody's smile didn't disappear all at once. It went out the way a light bulb goes, one flicker, then nothing. He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The quitclaim deed with my forged signature. The suspended notary, not her." I nodded toward the woman with the portfolio who visibly exhaled. A different one. The 2 shell LLCs, the prior property fraud scheme in Hialeah, which, by the way, the victim's family documented perfectly. The cash payment, all of it. 47 pages, tabbed and indexed. Complete silence. Then I said, "So, here's what I'd like to do, Cody. Before we go any further with this notary visit, let's go to the police station first. They asked me to bring you in the moment I saw you. I think they have a few questions." Caitlin made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. She said, "Dad," and stopped. Cody said, "Nathan, let's not. You're misunderstanding the situation." I said, "I'm 63 years old, and I've been watching you since the first day you walked into this house and asked me how much it was worth. Do I seem like a man who misunderstands situations?" He looked at me. Then he looked at the door. I said, "Don't." He didn't. The detective arrived 8 minutes later. She'd been a block away. We'd planned it. I texted her when I heard the second car pull in. She knocked on the open front door and stepped into my living room and looked at Cody Jenkins with the flat, professional patience of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment with the paperwork to back it up. She said, "Mr. Jenkins." "I'm Detective Wells." I said, "Mr. Parker, you want to finish the introduction." I said, "No, go ahead." "You've earned it." She said, "Mr. Jenkins, I'm going to need you to come with me. You have the right to remain silent." "This is insane," Cody said. His voice cracked on the last word. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Caitlin, tell them." Caitlin turned her back on him. It was quiet and deliberate, and I thought the bravest thing I'd ever seen my daughter do. She walked to the window and looked out at the yard, at the bird of paradise and the mango tree, and she didn't say a word. The detective kept going. "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." She cuffed him right there in my living room. On the hardwood floors Brittany and I had refinished together in 2009. He was still talking. Rapid, escalating. The language getting more creative and less coherent with every second. As she walked him out my front door, down my porch steps, and put him in the back of the unmarked car outside. The notary, who had not said a single word, picked up her portfolio, looked at me and said, "For what it's worth, I had no idea what this document was for." He told me it was a property transfer by mutual agreement. I said, "Then you'll want to talk to the detective before you leave. She'll have questions." The notary nodded and walked out, and then it was just me and Caitlin. She stood at the window for a long time. I stood in the middle of my living room and waited because I had learned from Brittany, from 30 years of being somebody's parent, that you can't pull a person through grief. You have to let them walk. Finally, Caitlin said, "How long did you know?" I said, "I suspected from the first night I met him. I had evidence since the day after your wedding." She turned around. Her face was a complicated thing. Grief and anger and relief and embarrassment all stacked on top of each other. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you were happy, and I needed more than suspicion, and I needed him to show his cards completely." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The house, it's still yours." I said, "It was never his to sell. I put it in an irrevocable trust last year, right after you two got engaged. The deed he forged was void the second he filed it. The purchase agreement with the cash buyer is void. The whole transaction never legally existed." She stared at me. I said, "Sierra did good work." "Who's Sierra?" "My attorney." Caitlin sat down on the couch. She put her face in her hands. I sat next to her and put my arm around her, the way I used to when she was small and the world had been too much for one day. She said, "I'm so sorry, Dad." I said, "I know." "Sweetheart," she said, "I didn't know about the deed. He told me. He said you'd agreed to put the house in both our names as an early inheritance. He said you told him you wanted to." "I know," I said again. "I know he did." We sat there for a while in the living room of the house that nobody had taken from us. In the city, we'd both lived in our whole lives, and I let her cry until she was done. Cody Jenkins was charged with real estate fraud, forgery, and filing a fraudulent instrument, felonies, all three. The Hialeah case was reopened. 2 additional fraud schemes were subsequently uncovered by the Financial Crimes Unit, both involving elderly property owners, both using the same LLC structure. The cash buyer, the LLC that had been set to purchase my house, was investigated and found to be connected to a mortgage fraud ring that had been operating in Miami-Dade County for 4 years. Cody's real estate license, which I had not known he actually held, buried under all the fake LLCs, was suspended pending trial. His BMW was repossessed. His watch, it turned out, was leased. The trial lasted 4 days. Cody's attorney argued that the quitclaim deed was the result of a misunderstanding, that Cody had genuinely believed he had authority to file on behalf of the family, that the whole thing was a clerical error blown grotesquely out of proportion. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They came back with guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Cody Jenkins to 7 years in state prison. He was 30 years old on the day he was sentenced. He would be 37 when he got out, assuming good behavior, which, based on everything I'd learned about his character, I considered a modest assumption at best. Caitlin filed for annulment 6 weeks after the arrest. The grounds were fraud, specifically that she had entered the marriage based on material misrepresentations about Cody's character, intentions, and financial dealings. Sierra, who had by that point become something of a family attorney, handled the paperwork. The annulment was granted. My daughter moved back in with me for 3 months while she got her feet under her. She slept in her old room under the same ceiling fan she'd had since she was 12. We watched movies on Friday nights. I taught her how to make Brittany's arroz con pollo, which she'd always said was too complicated to learn, but turned out to be easier than she'd thought once she actually paid attention. She never said Cody's name again, not in my house. Not that I heard anyway. I didn't ask. She got a new apartment in Wynwood in the spring. On the day she moved out, she stood on my porch with 2 suitcases and looked at me with those eyes she'd had since she was 3 days old and said, "Thank you, Dad, for all of it. For not telling me. For waiting. For building the file." I said, "Your mother would have done the same thing." She smiled. That full-body smile, the lit from the inside one. "No," she said. "Mom would have confronted him at the rehearsal dinner and made it a whole thing." I laughed, genuinely for the first time in a long time. "You're not wrong," I said. "The house sold eventually. Not to a cash buyer through a fraudulent LLC, but to a young couple with a toddler and a baby on the way who fell in love with the yard, especially the mango tree. I was 64 by then, and I decided on my own terms, no notary, no Cody Jenkins, no assisted, living in Coconut Grove, that it was time to simplify. I bought a smaller place 3 blocks from the water, a condo, 2 bedrooms, a balcony where I can have my coffee and watch the pelicans. I kept the bird of paradise, dug it up myself, and replanted it on the balcony in a big clay pot. Brittany always said those plants were indestructible if you knew how to care for them. She was right about that. She was right about most things. Morgan came over for dinner the first week I was in the new place, and we sat on the balcony with our beers and looked at the water. And he said, "Nathan, you planned that whole thing out 18 months in advance. You set every single trap and let him walk into all of them." I said, "I just paid attention. That's all." He said, "Most people don't pay that kind of attention." I thought about that for a minute. About Cody Jenkins in his prison uniform in some state facility, 3 years into a 7-year sentence, about the house that had never legally been his, about the forged signature of mine he'd pressed into an official document and filed with a county clerk who happened to know me by first name, about my daughter's smile, about Brittany's voice in a hospital room. Keep an eye on our girl. She trusts too easy. I said, I made a promise to someone. I kept it. Morgan didn't ask who. He already knew. We finished our beers. The pelicans worked the water below us, indifferent and efficient, the way living things are when they know exactly what they're doing. I watched them for a while. Then I went inside and made dinner. Some people look at a 63-year-old widower living alone in Miami and see an easy mark. That's always been their first mistake. And with Cody Jenkins, it was the only mistake he ever got to make.